Hello. This week I'm going to share a little bit about kids and boundaries and consent. So, why is it important for us to create space for our kids to develop skills around boundaries and consent? What comes up for us as adults as we try to create that space and try to create an environment where our kids can express their boundaries and consent? And what happens if we don't allow our kids the opportunity to develop skills in this area? All right, let's talk about kids, boundaries, and consent. So before I get into how this all relates to parenting and collaborative approaches, I want to first define boundaries. So boundaries are what creates separateness. It allows us to have our own feelings and needs, and with boundaries, we're actually able to access more strategies to meet our needs than if we constantly had to rely on others to meet our needs, or if we had to please others. So, yeah, boundaries really is about separateness, recognizing how interconnected we all are. That's a bit confusing, isn't it? I can see why this is such a hard topic. Consent is based on voluntary agreement. So it's agreement that hasn't been manipulated or coerced. And voluntary agreement is actually based on our understanding of our boundaries, so our needs and our feelings. Consent can't happen without that understanding of what it is we're feeling, what it is we're needing, and that sense of separateness. Consent also cannot happen without freedom to say no. And this is why boundaries and consent are so important when it comes to parent-child relationships, or really any relationship where one party might have more power than the other. Previously, I shared about why collaborative approaches are valuable, or why you would want to lean into collaborative approaches more often. And right now I want to just take a moment to explore two extremes. So one extreme would be if only the parents' boundaries and consent were expressed. And the other extreme is if only a child's boundaries and consent were expressed. So if only a parent's boundaries and consent are expressed, then we've really created or maintained a top-down hierarchy approach. It creates this environment where either the child is going to learn to be a people pleaser and adhere to the parents' boundaries and consent, or the child might, if their needs still feel strongly to them, they might then position themselves to rebel and go against your expression as a parent, your expression of your boundaries and needs. I think the key is that your boundaries and needs are important. We just want to make sure that you're also listening to your child's boundaries and needs. So let's flip this situation and let's consider for a moment if only the child's boundaries and needs are expressed. Again, it's a huge source of disconnection. The child is able to get awareness about what their needs are, but if they can't connect to the others around them, if your needs as a parent aren't also expressed, if your boundaries aren't also expressed, then they're learning that their needs are the only ones that matter. And that's not the kind of person I want my child to grow up to be. I want them to grow up to get along well with others and to be able to advocate for themselves. So we really do want to aim for that balance of both adult and child are expressing their boundaries and their consent. So the collaborative approach isn't focusing on one set of needs trumping the other. A collaborative approach is everyone's needs matter. We're not looking to make a compromise where we drop someone's needs. or give up or sacrifice needs. We're actually looking for ways to make joyful agreements. I know that sounds cheesy, joyful agreements, but it really is what we're going for. We're looking for consent, voluntary consent. And because consent can change, as we become more aware of what our boundaries are, a better understanding of where we want to have boundaries, we might need to go back to the agreements that we made and make changes. And that's totally normal. We actually want that to happen. That's an expression of being self-aware about your boundaries and self-aware of healthy, or sorry, not self-aware, and an awareness about healthy consent. Being able to change our mind is so important. So whenever we're making agreements, we're also keeping those agreements open enough that if it isn't working for someone, they feel safe enough to open up the conversation again and try to renegotiate and find something that meets everyone's needs and reach that place of joyful agreement and voluntary consent. Now, some people might be thinking, kids aren't capable or mature enough to make their own choices or to know what their boundaries are. They need me to come in and tell them what to do. This one's really tough for me. I want to challenge you to shift your mindset a little bit from sort of like this static idea about what they can't do and shift it to a growth mindset of how can we help them develop this maturity? How do we help them develop this capacity? And so to develop this capacity to make their own decisions and become aware of what their boundaries are, we need to give them opportunities to develop their self-awareness so that they can become aware of what their boundaries are. We need to give them opportunities to express their boundaries and their consent or their lack of consent. We need to honor that so that they can feel heard and their process is reinforced. And we need to give them lots of opportunities to make mistakes and experience natural consequences. And that, all of those pieces are really, really tough for parents. This topic can be so tricky for parents for a number of reasons. I think the biggest reason being it's so triggering for us. Our own experiences with boundaries and consent really sets us up for how we respond to our kids and their expressions of boundaries and consent. So maybe that's our lack of awareness of our own boundaries. Maybe our boundaries were violated or our consent was coerced or diminished or ignored. All of our experiences related to boundaries and consent pop up in our parenting experiences, inviting us in to do some healing, to do some growth and learning, but it can feel really overwhelming. So I totally understand why this topic feels so sensitive for parents. Sometimes we've grown up in environments or cultures or families where our parents or authority figures didn't uphold our expression of boundaries and consent because maybe they didn't have the skill set themselves to do that. Maybe that was just the way they were raised. And, you know, they haven't had an opportunity to explore any of these topics. And as a result, now maybe we don't have this skill set and we're exploring it for the first time. It's not to say, you know, our parents are bad or wrong. Not saying that at all. I'm just saying that maybe they didn't have the chance to explore it. And now it's entering our consciousness. So we now have the chance to explore it and make choices that are in line with our values. But the work of exploring the topic of boundaries and consent, what we need to learn around collaborative approaches, It's definitely work. It takes time. It's a skill set we don't necessarily have. We might have to find other sources to help us learn and grow in this direction. And yeah, it's really tough. So I understand why parents feel hesitant about this topic and why it might feel so much more comfortable to just kind of like turn a blind eye, do things the way we've always done them, knowing that in the back of your mind, maybe there's a part of you that's nagging at your heart, nagging at your thoughts that, you know what, this doesn't quite feel right, or I feel some disconnection and I don't want to feel that disconnection. So all of this is related. It goes beyond parenting. Boundaries and consent goes beyond parenting, and yet it's so related to how we interact with our kids. It's so hard to identify a boundary. It's so hard to discover in ourselves, I have a need here. Once we've discovered that need and identifying it, then the next problem becomes, how do we express it to others so that they can then hold that need with care? And so expressing a boundary is its own skill set also. And then once you have expressed a boundary, so you've identified what you need, you've expressed it, now let's say someone oversteps that boundary, it's a whole other skill set figuring out how to uphold that boundary, how to have a conversation to go back and explain what that boundary was and what you're needing. You know, that's a really big skill set, and I'm going to talk about that next time. I'm going to go into conflict a little bit more. But you can see why, this is all so triggering and makes for a lot of growth and learning for parents. It's tough, I get it. If we give our kids experiences that are only related to adhering to authority, power over, experiences where they need to do what they're told or get in trouble or experience consequences for not doing what they're told, or rewards for doing what they're told, they don't ever get a chance to develop a sense of agency related to consent and boundaries. And this is so important because think about what that means. They don't get a chance to understand and become aware of their needs and their boundaries. Maybe they learn, they do have an awareness, but then they learn to ignore their needs and boundaries so that they can be liked or loved or fit in with others. Maybe they can't access strategies to meet their own needs. Maybe they're looking to others to come in and save them, or they're looking to others to meet their needs or to even know what they want. I wonder how many of you are sitting there thinking, yeah, I'm guilty of that. I wanted my partner to know what I needed without me expressing myself. And I got angry at them for not just automatically knowing what I needed. Maybe they don't know how to express consent or their lack of consent. Maybe they don't know how to change their mind. Maybe they've gone along with something because they were kind of willing to. They didn't say it out loud, but now they've changed their mind and they don't know how to back out of a situation that no longer feels comfortable. Maybe they're not skilled at navigating boundaries of others. Maybe when someone expresses a boundary, they take it personally and they see it as their fault, not an expression of the other person's needs, but something that is offensive to them or upsetting to them or hurtful to them. maybe they don't look for or respect expressions of consent from others. Maybe they lack the skill set of being able to check for consent from others. These are all really important skills to develop in our world. And if we only give our kids opportunities to learn how to live in a world that's top-down approach, if we only give our kids opportunities in an authority atmosphere, they don't get a chance to develop all these really important skills. And as I'm sharing these skills, part of me is wondering, should I go into, worst case scenarios of how these things could play out, how lack of consent can play out? I'm not going to. I'll leave that for you to think about further. But these skills of discovering our needs, expressing our boundaries, following through when our boundaries are not adhered to, those are so, so, so important. Folks who haven't developed a sense of boundaries, haven't been able to practice expressions of consent, receiving expressions of consent, they're more likely to be on that scale of power over. They don't have the skill sets to act collaboratively, so they're more likely to either play the role of perpetrators of violence or discomfort, or victims of violence and discomfort. And neither of those are good options. I want my kids to have something different than that. I want that for myself and for everyone else in the world and everyone else around me. So for the folks who find themselves with a lot of power, but still have people powering over them, the perpetrator role, the manipulator role, some of the things that we know from psychology is that when folks feel like there is a degree of separation between their actions and the receiver of their actions, they're more likely to go along with different forms of violence. They're more likely to be complicit than if they were more connected to the folks who are experiencing their outcomes. I mean, just right now as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, I wonder how our environment might be different if we were more connected to the outcomes of our actions in the world. Also, for folks who tend to fall more into that, they have more power, they have more opportunities to exercise power, they can be in a manipulator, perpetrator role, and often if the authority that is above them asking them to do actions feels really strong or powerful or well-known or has a powerful reputation, they're more likely to go against their own sense of agency and override their ethics on behalf of the power that's above them. So this is how we become complicit to do things in the world that we wouldn't otherwise agree to do on our own. It's how we turn a blind eye to violence against others, against the world in general. So that could be our environment. And the victim role, I mean, that one's not very pretty either, right? Predators and manipulators, they look for easy targets. They are looking for the people who will do a lot to be liked or to feel loved. They're looking for the people who are less likely to say something when a boundary is violated. Now, this stuff feels uncomfortable to talk about, probably feels uncomfortable for you to be listening to it, But I think it's so important to talk about, because the more we can help our kids develop skill sets in understanding their needs, understanding their boundaries, voicing consent, checking with others for consent, being respectful of the expressions of boundaries and needs of others, the more we can do that, the less likely our kids will experience these tragic forms of violence. So to me, there's a big incentive for us to lean into this collaborative approach. And I just want to, once again, I know I say this a lot, but I want to create a lot of space for us as parents. You might be sitting there thinking, yeah, I'm totally on board with a collaborative approach. And I encourage you to keep going in that direction. There's going to be times where it's not going to work out in a collaborative way. But keep trying, keep moving in that direction. That's how we create a world that is more peaceful and more collaborative and more creative. So keep leaning into that direction in all the ways that you can. Have compassion for yourself for those times when you can't, or for those times when maybe you really want to make a choice to do a power over approach because there's another need that's present that really needs to be met. But yeah, a moment of compassion here for all of us parents who maybe feel aligned with these collaborative approaches, and yet sometimes it can feel so overwhelming, right? So a moment of compassion for all of us. I don't often like to make judgment statements, but I've got two. Don't make your kid an easy target to be violated. Don't set your kid up to be complicit in a system that causes violence towards others. It's possible to create an environment where kids get a skill set so that they can be in collaboration with others, so that they can see that everyone's needs matter. They don't have to experience the pain of being a perpetrator or being a victim. There's another option. And I know that those are really big words. You know, they sound like, I don't know, maybe you're listening to this thinking that I'm sounding dramatic. And I'm not, my intention is that even when we experience being a perpetrator or a victim in subtle ways, those subtle ways still create discomfort in us. It doesn't, like somewhere inside of us, it doesn't feel good to create violence or to be a part of violence or to receive violence. And I mean violence in that NVC, nonviolent communication way. Give your kids space to check in with themselves, identify their needs, identify their boundaries, express their boundaries, uphold their boundaries if their boundaries are violated. And for you as a parent, you know, helping them in each step of that process, slowing things down so that they can try to identify what their needs are, helping them to express their boundaries if they're feeling uncomfortable, and helping them to uphold their boundaries. All of these ways that we can support them, that's a form of advocacy. We don't have to do the work for them. In fact, I don't think we should be doing the work for them. We're creating space for them to do their own work. But there are times when it's really hard to slow down and identify, okay, what just happened there? That didn't feel right, but I haven't processed that yet. I think that didn't feel right to me because there was a boundary there. How do I express that boundary to the other person? Now that I've expressed that boundary and they've gone ahead and done what they wanted to anyway, how do I communicate this to them that it's not okay with me? Our job as a parent is to help them in the areas that they're struggling. And I wouldn't say that it's just our job as a parent. I actually think this is our role in all of our relationships. If we see someone struggling to identify a boundary or struggling to express consent or lack of consent, or helping someone to uphold their expression of consent or lack of consent. I think, it's a pro-human thing to do to help others in the world in the areas that they're struggling to. And to do that work, we have to do the work ourselves first. Whenever it pops up for us, whenever we feel triggered, or whenever we feel comfortable to explore our triggers. So I think, especially as parents, the hardest one to tackle is probably when our kids are expressing themselves. So they've identified their needs, they've identified their boundaries, they've expressed their boundaries, and now other folks are reacting to their expression of boundaries. That can feel really uncomfortable. Sometimes people have a really hard time when other people express their boundaries. Doesn't necessarily mean that we need to change our boundaries. That's their thing. That's their thing to explore with curiosity and openness. But our kids might need some help doing that. They live in a world where they inherently don't have the same power as the adults in their lives. So being able to express and uphold boundaries, we might need to play a strong advocacy role for them in those situations. Sorry, just catching my breath. I still have lung issues that I'm trying to work out. But when we rob our kids of the chance to develop these skills, we inadvertently set them up to be in positions of either having a lot of power or having no power. So either the perpetrator or the victim. And again, I know those sound like really big dramatic words, but even when they're in situations where those roles are subtly expressed, they're still being subtly expressed. And I think it's really important to move forward, to get to a place where human beings can work collaboratively, come up with creative solutions together where all needs matter, not just those in power. I think it's really important that we create space for our kids to develop these skills. And sometimes that might mean being an advocate and helping them hold firm or slow down or express themselves when they need to. Thank you so much for watching today. It was such a pleasure to share this with you. If you enjoyed this video, please press the follow button so that you can receive more videos. If you know of anyone who might really appreciate the content in this video, please share it with them. I love to have new people joining me in this space. And if you have a comment, I would love to hear your comments also. All right, thanks. Bye.